Hi, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to today's Grow With Us. I know we took a little bit of a break. We'll get started in just about a minute or two. I'm just going to give some more time for people to come into the room. I don't want them to miss anything, and to get connected. All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's Grow With Us. We're going to be talking about composting, which I'm very excited to learn more about. I know there's a lot of kind of like exciting new products and things that are out there. So I think it'll be like a really good starting point for us today. And then Grow With Us is a program that we do in partnership with the Office of Environmental Quality and Sustainability. If you want to learn more about us, you can just click on our library market program, and I can also put the link in the chat later on. Today we have Barry from the Dallas County Master Gardeners presenting. And Barry, if you're ready, you can go ahead and start.
As mentioned, I'm a Dallas County Master Gardener. This class or course that we're presenting is Composting 101. I'm also a vegetable specialist, with having taken advanced training in vegetables, and I'm also a certified Master Gardener. Master Gardeners are a volunteer arm of Texas A&M Agricultural Extension. The mission is to educate the public practices. So the question that comes up is, what is compost? Well, compost can be used as a noun and also as a verb. When used as a noun, humus-rich material that results from composting. Shown in the picture, it's the composition of about coffee grinds. When it's used as a verb, it's the controlled decomposition or decay of organic material. It's a process that's sometimes referred to as composting. The question comes up as to why do we compost? Well, everything that you can put in your compost bin or your compost pile is something that has not gone into the city waste landfill. And so it takes items that would otherwise be considered as waste, landfill, and it converts those into material that, when added to the soil, benefits plant life and the environment. It also saves the consumer or the composter person money, because purchasing compost is not necessarily necessary if you can produce it on your own. What are the benefits of composting? It conditions and adds nutrients to the soil. Nutrients such as nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus. These are the three items that you usually see on a bag of fertilizer. The three numbers being K, tells you the chemical composition of the fertilizer. The good thing about these nutrients is it also adds micro nutrients to the soil. Compost does, that is, which include calcium, iron, sulfur, zinc, boron, magnesium, manganese, copper, and I can't remember what the Na stands for, but maybe it'll come to me in a minute. Compost also improves soil structure. It helps the soil retain water, and it breaks up clay soil. In the absence of these things, the clay soil in Dallas would be extremely difficult to work. For those of you who have not used compost before, you'll find that the soil is much easier to work when there's compost added to it. It also increases the erosion resistance of the soil and prevents nutrients from washing out, makes the soil a lot easier to work. It's beneficial to soil life. There is life in the soil that you cannot see because it's microscopic. Some of it you can view without a microscope. Worms in your garden or beetles, things like this. But it's beneficial to soil life because it feeds the soil life, and the soil life in turn converts nitrogen in the air to nitrogen which is available for plants. Keeps the soil loose and aerated, and it reduces or eliminates pests and disease that otherwise reside in the soil. And finally, it improves water quality. As I just mentioned earlier, it helps the soil to retain water, and it eliminates water runoff. It also improves root growth, and it's much better than synthetic fertilizer, and it reduces the need for that type of fertilizer. The need for chemical pesticides is also reduced and eliminated, and that increases the water quality because those are not running off into the water, the storm sewers. There's a few terms that need to be defined in this discussion. The first one is green material. I'll be referring to green material throughout this discussion. And green material is basically organic materials such as green grass clippings, vegetable trimmings, fresh manure. It also includes things such as shrub trimmings that where you've pruned your shrubs or you've pruned your trees. That can go in there, and those also constitute green materials. Brown materials are also organic materials, but these are materials that typically are brown in color. These include dead leaves, dry hay, dry wood chips, paper and paper products, and a number of other items which I'll mention later on. Aerobic. Aerobic means having sufficient free oxygen to support respiration. You've probably heard of the term in the context of aerobic exercise. Same concept applies here, and getting oxygen into the compost material support respiration of the various organisms that are living in it. Anaerobic, it's the opposite of aerobic. It means not having sufficient free oxygen to support respiration. Microorganism, these are living things that are only visible through a microscope, and the host is just loaded with microorganisms. It's been said that in 1 tablespoon of compost, there are more organistic animals than there are people in the world. There's 4 elements to compost. One is carbon. This is brown material. It's denoted by a C, which comes from the periodic table of chemicals. Brown material, as I said previously, includes things such as dead leaves, paper, twigs, branches, pretty much anything that is brown. There are some things that are brown material which are not necessarily brown in color, and we'll get to that in a moment. The next element is nitrogen. This is green material. It's evidenced by N, which is stands for nitrogen on the periodic. Things such as food scraps, grass clippings, shrub trimmings, newspaper. Well, you'll see in a moment. We'll talk about some oxygen, O2. This is air, just plain air that we breathe. It's required for all the microorganisms that are in the compost, and it's an essential thing. And as you'll see later on, the compost bin smelling. Moisture, H2O, plain old water. Ideally, you should use rainwater if you happen to collect it, but have rainwater, water that comes out of tap, adequate to use as well. In making the compost, there's basically components. There's a biotic component and an abiotic component. There's a food chain in biotic components, which is comprised of decomposters and consumers. And there's 3 levels of consumer, which are primary, secondary, and tertiary. These biotic components are things that we really don't have a whole lot of control over. Mother Nature will send them into the compost bin as Mother Nature feels appropriate. Some of the items that we do have control over are abiotic components. This is the amount of air and water that's in the compost bin, and the temperature that the compost bin or pile is allowed to climb to. Temperature can also mean the ambient temperature that surrounds the compost bin, such as water or, not water, but cold or hot temperatures. The secondary abiotic components include particle size, the surface area of the compost bin or pile, the volume, and how often it's turned. These are all things that we can definitely control, and we'll talk about those in just a moment. So in the compost food chain, and this is inside the compost pile, we have decomposters. These are critters that consume or eat dead plants and decompose them, reducing them to simpler forms of matter. These consist primarily of fungi and bacteria. The type of decomposers that come to mind are mold and yeast. Earthworms are also decomposers, and earthworms fall into several categories. But these decomposers will eat only decaying organic material. Then we have consumers, and the consumers consist, as I mentioned earlier, of 3 different levels. We have primary consumers. These eat plants, they eat other decomposers that I've just discussed, and they also eat other primary consumers. This includes things such as protozoa, some insects such as small flies, slugs, snails, earthworms, and sow bugs. And there you appear, the materials that I'm referencing, or excuse me, the consumers I'm referencing appear in that blue level in this pile in the slide. We then have secondary consumers. These eat primarily other consumers. These include small springtails, beetle mites, mold, feather-winged beetles, which are some of the world's smallest flying insects, flatworms, roundworms, and other protozoa. And those are located, in case you can't read it, in the purple or reddish purple level there. The last of the tertiary consumers, these are higher level predators. They eat primarily secondary consumers and primary consumers. These include things like ground and rove beetles, bugs, ants, centipede, pseudoscorpions, and small spiders. There are tools that you need in order to maintain and create compost. The must-have are a compost bin, and that's qualified, and I'll explain that in a minute. A pitchfork or a three-prong rake, and this is so you can turn the compost. Gloves, because what you're basically going to be dealing with, in addition to organic material and all the decomposers and consumers that I mentioned, is the excrement from these animals. Excrement being basically poop. So you want to be sure and wear gloves. You'll need compost materials. These are the brown and green materials that I mentioned earlier. And you'll need a water source and a hose. It's possible you will need dried molasses, depending upon whether ants infest the compost pile or not. Cottonseed meal as a possible green starter, and a compost thermometer. When I say compost thermometer, you can basically buy a thermometer that will serve this purpose in a grocery store. The only problem with the food thermometers that the grocery store sells is that they only go down maybe 12 inches at the most. There are compost thermometers available, which will go down 2 or 3 feet and give you a better measurement in the center of the compost bin. One of the tools I mentioned is compost bins. And compost bins come in all different sizes and shapes. This is just a variety of some of them that are offered. Compost bin, and I don't know if this is showing up on the slide or not, but the compost bin that shows second on the top row, second from the left, the third from the left, and the far right at the bottom row. Those are manufactured and can be purchased for composting. I don't particularly care for them because most of them do not come in contact with the ground. You put your green and brown materials in them, and the compost is created, but it's created in the absence of many of the many of the consumers and decomposers that need to get in there because there is no contact with the soil. As a result, things like earthworms and other insects cannot get in there. The best ones, to my view, are the wooden ones, like in the top left corner and the top right corner. But you can also make compost bins out of different substances, as shown on the bottom row. My personal favorites are the multi-stage bins and a shepherd's bin. The multi-stage bins are just made out of shipping pallets, but in making those, you have to be sure that the shipping pallets you're using are not made from pressure-treated wood. If you go online, you can find a guide to the symbols that appear on the ends of these pallets that will tell you whether they're safe to use for compost bins or whether they've been pressure treated and should not be used. The shepherd's bin is a product that's sold through, surprisingly or not, a company called Shepherd's. It's out of Houston, Texas, and the bin works very well. The thing that you see in the middle is to allow air and also water to penetrate to the center of the bin. The nice thing about it is when it's time to turn the compost bin, the outside of that cage will lift right up, and you can turn the bin, excuse me, you can turn the compost material into a new location by setting down the fence and the chimney in the center in a new spot. My own multi-stage compost bin, side yard, and it's designed to be used on a rotating basis. The chimneys that you see there are nothing more than PVC pipe, 4-inch PVC pipe that has had holes drilled in it. It lets air into the center of the composting material, and it also, if you want to put a hose down, it gets water more efficiently into the center of the compost. Stage 1 is which is shown here, goes in the first bin, and it's material that is the rawest that you have. As you can see, there's straw, there's some green twigs, and it appears that there's some coffee grinds. All this fresh stuff goes into the first bin. And that has decomposed or started to decompose at a good rate. It's then transferred to the second bin. And the materials put in the second bin will look like this. And while that appears to be coarser than what was put in the first bin, that's actually just dried leaves that have not decomposed. But underneath that, you'll find that there are some materials that have significantly broken down. And when that's moved into the second bin, then you start in the first bin all over again, and with new materials. When the second bin has aged a little more, and the same with the first bin, when they both aged more, you then rotate it again, and you move what was in the second bin to the third bin, what was in the first bin to the second bin, and you start a new batch of compost in the first bin. And the reason I like this is because it's continual. You always have compost working. You don't have to wait on something to complete and then start all over from the beginning. You always have something in process. So what compost materials do you add? On the brown material side, you can add cardboard, which has been shredded, corn stalks and corn cobs also, which have been shredded, dry grass, dead grass, dead leaves, dry straw, dryer lint. But let me add this: you can only add dryer lint if you're drying clothing with natural fibers. If you have Dacron, nylon, polyester materials, you cannot use that dryer lint. Shredded newspaper can also be used, but you need to be careful and make sure that the shredded newspaper, that the print is not a petroleum-based ink, that it's a soy-based ink. I have been told, although I have not verified it, that the Dallas Morning News uses a soy-based ink, so it is safe to put in the compost bin. So you can put sawdust in the compost bin, but not too much. If you put too much sawdust in the compost bin, your compost pile will become very acidic, and we don't want that. And lastly, you can add wood shavings. From the green material side, that is nitrogen, you can add things like algae, seaweed, and lakeweed, coffee grounds. Even though coffee grounds are brown, it's considered a green material. You can also add the coffee filters. They don't decompose quite as fast as some of the other things, but the microbial activity will cause them to decompose. You can add cottonseed meal, but let me add a warning here that cottonseed meal is stuff that has possibly been treated. The cotton in Texas has been plagued with boll weevils. The cotton fields are usually sprayed by airplanes and treated with chemicals to get rid of the cotton bolls, or excuse me, the cotton weevils. Whether that makes it to the seed is not unclear. I do not put cottonseed meal in my own compost pile because of that particular factor. Another thing that can be added on the green material side are food scraps. And that is also qualified, and I'll get to that in just a moment, but because not all food scraps can be added. Green grass clippings can be added, and green leaves from pruning. Human hair can be added. There's a story that came up in my composting class that I took about a woman who went to the beauty salon and collected the hair from the floor that had been swept up periodically and put it in her compost bin. It did decompose, but since in beauty shops or salons, a lot of the hair that falls on the floor has been colored, which uses dyes. Some of those dyes are organic, some of them are not. It's not clear whether the hair from salons and beauty shops can be used. If you're going to collect hair for your compost bin, I would suggest collecting it from a barber shop where there's less chance of having colored hair. Manure can be used also, but this is from herbivores only. You cannot use manure from anything that eats meat. It can be used from cows, sheep, chickens, things like that. You can also use human urine. The same woman that collected from the salon also saved her own urine, or she said she did, and monthly would pour it onto the compost bin. Whether you want to do that or not, it's up to you. My compost bin gets along fine without it. You can also add wool to the compost bin. So you have an old sweater that's that you knitted that's worn out, cut it up and throw it in the compost bin. It'll decompose. What not to add to the compost? This is almost more important than what you add, because if you add any of these things, they can cause real problems. Ash from coal or charcoal may contain materials that harm plants, so you don't want to use that. Ashes from clean wood, and by clean wood, I mean you go to the Home Depot or Lowe's and you buy some lumber, and you have leftover pieces of lumber, and it's burned in the fireplace or a fire pit, and it's never been converted to charcoal or been painted or anything like that. It's okay to use a small amount, but if you put too much in, it'll raise the pH and make the compost pile more alkaline. And in Dallas, Texas, you don't want anything to be more alkaline. Black walnut tree leaves should never be used. I should have underscored this. Black walnut tree leaves contain a substance which will inhibit the decomposing process. Diseased plants should not be entered in there for obvious reasons that it can end up spreading disease. The feces or poop of meat eaters should not be included. It can also contain disease. Fish scraps, no. Limestone, no. Limestone is very alkaline. It doesn't go well with the composting process. Olive pits, the caveat here is that, excuse me. Olive pits can be added, but if you add them, they will decompose so slowly that you will find by the time you get to the third bin, assuming you use the 3 bin stage, the olive pits are still there. It's not worth it to put them in. It's a nuisance. Should not include processing or manufacturing waste. No meat, fat, grease, or bones should be included. They will not decompose properly. And dairy products, as a general rule, should not be included, but they can be included in very, very small amounts, only if they're buried at least 8 inches deep into the compost pile. Oak leaves can be used. I use them in my compost bin. However, oak leaves decompose at a very slow rate. So as a general rule, I would say do not add them, especially live oak leaves. Pet waste and pet litter should not be added. The droppings from a bird cage can be used because birds are not meat eaters, but the waste from your dogs, your cats, things like that should not be used. Pine needles and pine cones, cedars and conifers. These can be used in small amounts, but I would not recommend adding them because they decompose exceptionally slowly. Pressure treated wood should not be used for the reasons I stated previously, and that is that they're treated with chemicals and they can be dangerous for use if you're going to put your compost in a vegetable garden. Runner spreaders. These are things like the runners you get with Bermuda grass or St. Augustine grass, or anything that pretty much spreads by runners. If you want to use these in the compost bin, you need to lay them out on a concrete surface like your driveway, and let them sit there for a few days and dry out in the sun. Once that's happened, you can then run them over with a lawnmower or shred them in some means and then put them in the compost bin. But if you put them in there as fresh runner spreaders, they will do exactly what they're supposed to do. They will create more runners and spread. Grass sod can be put in, but I would recommend avoiding it. And that's for the simple fact that the grass as sod will be more inclined to take off and grow than it will decompose. Weeds should not be put in there because generally it's the weed seeds, while some of them can be killed off by the heat generated in compost, you run the risk that the weeds that are seeding will not allow their seeds would not decompose. And as a result, you'll have weeds that you're spreading around when you spread your compost. And last, the most obvious is no toxic materials of any kind. What are the most common methods? There's 2 very common methods. The first is cold composting. This is also known as slow composting, passive composting, and cool composting. Second method is hot composting, known as fast composting. But I should qualify this by saying fast is a relative term when it comes to composting. Fast compost is something that may be 2 to 3 months or more. A slow compost, which is under the cold composting method, lasts as long as a year. How do you, what is cold composting? It's the simplest form of composting. It's just a pile of leaves out in the yard somewhere that you've created. It has very little maintenance. You can keep adding to it when you get material that you want to add to the compost pile. There's no limit on when or how much you can add, so it's continuous feed. The compost will form at the bottom of the pile. So when you want to take it out, you have to go to the bottom of the pile and retrieve it. The time for a cold composting method is anywhere from 6 to 12 months. You do not cover this type of compost pile. The temperature on the inside of the compost pile will get up to about 120 degrees, and that's even when the weather outside is cold. And it's rarely used in this method is rarely used in a compost bin. The hot composting method is much more complex than the cool composting method. In order to do a hot compost, you must have you must have at least 1 cubic yard of compost material. So equal to or greater than a cubic yard of compost material. And that's, to put it another way, that's 27 cubic feet of material, or a pile that is 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. There is higher maintenance in this method. However, it is a single feed method. In other words, you put all your materials together at one time to allow the batch to compost. And the entire batch will compost fairly uniformly all at once. You can cover this compost pile if you want. The temperatures, as you see there, are much higher than in the cool method, which is why this is called the hot method. We can get up to 160 degrees, and it's usually done in a compost bin. So you have these two methods. There, the slide compares them. I've gone over most of that in covering each one individually, and you can choose between the two. My preference is the hot composting method. It does take a little bit more work because of the maintenance, but it gets compost for you in a much shorter period. Maybe frozen here.
Barry.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought your audio stopped for a second.
No, I was the screen froze and I.
Okay, cool. Sorry.
Okay, that's okay. So how do you build a hot compost pile? Well, like I said, most of these are done inside of a bin. In the bin, you would place 3 to 6 inches of coarse brown material. And when I say coarse, I'm talking about branches, twigs, pieces of wood, maybe the size of your thumb or larger. Nothing that would get crushed down immediately. And this is to hold up the bottom of the composting material so air can circulate. Once it's all put in place, you water it uniformly until it's moist. On top of this, you add 3 to 6 inches of fresh grass clippings or other green material. You do not add water to this level. After you've done that, you add alternate layers of 3 to 6 inch of finely chopped brown material, and then the same volume of finely chopped green material. As each layer is put in, you water it, and you water the layer to meet what we refer to as a moist sponge test until the bin is full. And what the moist sponge test is, if you have a sponge that you have run under a sink faucet, and you squeeze out almost as much of the water as you can, the sponge is now not saturated, it's just moist. If you then squeeze the sponge and just a couple of few drops of water come out, that's what's considered a moist sponge. That testing applies to each level of the material as you put it in. So as you add material, first brown at the bottom, then green, which you do not add, then brown, which you do water, then green again, which you do water. And you keep doing this until everything is to the top of the bin. Any food material you put in needs to be buried 10 to 8, excuse me, 8 to 10 inches deep. And the reason for this is because in Dallas we have raccoons, possums, rats, mice. If you don't put the food materials down deep, the animals will find them and they will eat them, and they'll also tear up your compost pile. And at the end, like I said, you cover it with a plastic tarp, which is optional. It's not required. I don't do it, and but I do know people that do. Once this has all been built up, you let it sit. And then after a few days or maybe a week, you go out and you turn the pile to add oxygen to the pile. While you're turning, you add water. And again, the amount of water you add is to meet the moist sponge test. After you've turned the pile, if you want to, you can cover it again with plastic tarp. Once again, this is optional. As you turn and let the compost settle throughout this process, you will notice that the volume goes down. And the reason the volume's going down is because it's decomposing. So the material will be reduced by about 2/3 ultimately. And it's when it's uniformly brown in color with a texture like coffee grinds, and it's no longer generating heat, that's when you know that it's ready to be put in the garden. As I've noted here at the bottom, if it's turned every 3 days, the compost will be ready in less than 3 weeks. If it's turned weekly, it will be ready in 5 to 6 weeks. I will tell you from a personal experience, now I'm an old man, so it may not apply to you, but turning a compost bin every 3 days is a workout. And you will build your upper body very quickly by turning compost every 3 days. I turn it weekly, or in some instances, even less frequently. Here on the left is what we started with. You can see the different layers of green and brown material as you look at what's in the compost bin, the cage. And what ultimately happens is what you see on the right, which is ground texture finish of compost. Troubleshooting. There are problems that arise in composting because the decomposers and the other predators and animals that are in the compost bin doing the work for you, they'll do the work as long as you do the right things. So if your compost bin is not heating up, there's some problems that may exist. You've either got it too wet or too dry, too green, too brown, or it may be too small. And the problem that you're really looking for in it not heating up is that it's just plain finished. So when compost is ready, it will not heat up. It will not have those problems like are listed above. Whoops, that was a mistake. If the pile of and oftentimes you hear people say, "Well, I don't want to make compost because it smells." The fact of the matter is that if you do it right, compost does not smell at all. It has somewhat of a mild earthy flavor to it or scent to it. But if you're doing things right, it's not an issue. On the other hand, if it smells like rotten eggs, vinegar, or rancid butter, the pile has turned anaerobic. So just add oxygen. If it smells like ammonia, add brown and turn the pile to add oxygen. And when I said previously add oxygen, I mean turn the pile. Sometimes ants can get into the pile because you're putting food scraps in there. dried molasses is the solution to that. And if you will just add dried molasses as you turn the pile, eventually the ants will leave. I've been told the reason they leave is because they don't like the competition with all the microorganisms that are generated from the dried molasses. I mentioned this earlier that oak leaves, pine cones, and other conifers are very slow to decompose. Avoid them if you can. Composting tips. The smaller the particle that you put in the compost bin, the better. It will decompose faster. These are 3 methods I'm showing here of how you get small particle size. The first is to just run over in this example, to run over the dead leaves with a lawnmower. I do this, and when the bag is full for the lawnmower, I dump it out on the grass again and go over it a second time. I end up with very, very fine particles, and it works fairly well. That's probably the most common method. Another method, which I refer to as the milkshake method, is seen in the lower left photo. That's a garbage can that you see. And inside the garbage can, there are brown materials, such as leaves, branches, things like that. The tool that you see going down there is a weed eater. The way this is done is that you fill the garbage can. Well, first you put the weed eater in, then you fill the garbage can to the top with brown material, and you turn the garbage can, you turn the weed eater on. However, I should warn you, before you ever turn the weed eater on, put on earmuffs of some type to protect your hearing, or earplugs, and be sure and wear goggles or some type of protective glasses. Once that's done, you turn the weed eater on, and this acts like the old milkshake machines that you used to see in soda fountains. The weed eater will stir up the contents and break it up at the bottom, and what happens is the brown material will sink down in the trash can as the weed eater continues to make smaller particle sizes. Once the weed eater has done that, start pulling it up a little bit, and you'll get the brown material that has not made its way to the bottom. This is a very effective way to do it, but I'm not sure it's the most efficient. In my opinion, the most efficient method is to use a device very similar to the picture with the woman on the right side. This particular product is made by Toro. I have one personally. It's a leaf blower that you can convert into a leaf vacuum. And what happens is the leaves are sucked up into the vacuum, which at the end of the black tube has an impeller. The impeller is very sharp. It's made of metal. And as the leaves go through there into the bag that you see the woman carrying on her hip, the leaves are chopped up. They come out very fine. It's a very efficient method. According to the manufacturer, that bag will hold the equivalent of 7 lawn and leaf bags, and you can put that much material in it. The manufacturer's claims are true, because I filled up 7 lawn and leaf bags and ran them through the machine, and sure enough, it fit in there. However, what they don't tell you is that the lawn and leaf bags, the 7 lawn and leaf bags, once they're chopped up and put in the Toro bag, have the weight of 7 lawn and leaf bags. So they get pretty heavy. I wouldn't recommend putting that much into the bag personally. But these are 3 methods to make your particle size smaller. Just some other tips. Locate your bin where water does not puddle. And when it rains, that is, it does not puddle when it rains, but where the compost bin can get rained on, preferably in a shady spot. Don't locate the bin near a house or a wood fence or a tree. There have been reports that the compost bin itself, the wooden bin that is, can attract termites. So you certainly don't want those affecting a fence or your house. And avoid overwatering. How do you know when your compost is ready? Well, it should not be warm to the touch. It should have an earthy aroma. It should be dark and crumbly and like coffee grinds. There's a smudge test you can run. You take a sample of the compost between your fingers, and the sample should be fragile, flaky, and leave a dark smudge on your fingers, as illustrated by the young lad in the photo there. Usually when I'm presenting this in person, I ask the audience to respond as to which of these two pictures reflect completed compost. Since that is not available in this instance, I will just tell you both of these are completed compost. Most people will say the one on the right is completed, the one on the left isn't. The fact of the matter is that when compost is completed and there's no heat being generated, it will tend to kind of have a gray cast to it. If you were to break up that compost right there, and that was surrounded by a bin, it has been lifted off. But if you were to break that up, inside that gray mass, you would find compost that looks very much like the photo on the right. How do you harvest your compost? Well, as you see in the picture there, some of the material has not actually decomposed. It's still in a form that needs decomposing. And what you can do, and I've done this personally myself, is take hardware cloth and create a screen to separate the finished from the unfinished compost material. If you're using this to make compost for a lawn or for planting or laying sod, you need to use 1-inch hardware cloth. For potting or as a top dressing for a lawn, 3/8 of an inch or a 1/2 inch screen. For a vegetable garden or a bonsai, 1/4 inch. What stays on the screen, and the way this works is you just put it on the screen and you kind of sit there like the old gold miners, and you shake the screen or you use a trowel to rub the materials through the screen. And what stays on the screen, you can use to inoculate a new compost bin. And the rest of it that falls through, you use for garden mulch. And hardware cloth, contrary to the sound of it, is not cloth. It is a wire material. You can buy it at any of the big box hardware stores. There's other composting methods besides the two we've talked about. There's food digesters. There's worm or vermicomposting, bokashi, hugelkultur, and trench and sheet composting. Food digester is really easy to set up. You take let me go back to this. It'll handle almost all foods with the exception of meats, bones, and things like that. Especially useful for handling vegetable scraps and fruit scraps. It's safe from animals, so it doesn't matter what's in there. There's no smell, and it's a continual process. As I've noted on the tip, do not put meat or pet feces in this container. So how do you make it? You can use a 20 or 30 gallon plastic garbage can with a tight fitting lid. You dig a hole that is you can dig a hole that's 1/2 to 2/3 of I'll start over again. You dig a hole so that 1/2 to 2/3 of the container will sit inside the hole. You drill small holes around the top perimeter of the container And that's not what is shown in that picture. When I say the top, I mean the part near the lid. And that's to let air in, so there's a constant flow of air. On the bottom portion of the container, you cut large openings so that where the container will sit in the ground so that the earth is in contact with those holes. You place the container in the ground, in the hole that is, and you start adding food scraps. Be sure you secure the lid. And just as a tip, locate the container where it's easily accessible, like maybe outside a kitchen door or someplace like that, so you can put your scraps into it. Food scraps should be chopped up and in small pieces. You can buy a food digester, but as of 6 years ago, these were the costs in at Abundant Earth online and in Walmart online. And you can do it for a lot less yourself. How do you harvest the food digester? You can shovel the compost that results out of the barrel bucket with just a trowel, and not necessary to separate anything. Another method is to remove the can from the hole, dump its contents, and separate the compost from the food that isn't decomposed. This type of compost can be used in your garden or on your yard. The food that's not decomposed stays in the can or goes back into the can, and the process starts all over. You start adding new material. Another type of composting, and this is indoor composting, called vermicomposting, and it's using worms. And these are not earthworms like you see in the garden. These are special worms, and I'll describe them to you in a minute. These particular types of setups allow the worms to consume vegetables and fruit scraps, and the amount of compost produced depends on the size of the bin. It usually does not smell unless it's been mismanaged, and it's very easy to manage. The two products for the garden that are created are worms and vermicompost. The way this is handled is you find a bin, whatever size you want to meet your preference, and it can be anything from the size of a toaster oven to something larger. You drill holes in the lid for air to prevent the worms, and to prevent the worms from escaping, as you see in the photo there, cover the holes with nylon screen. You have to create a bed for the worms, and the bed that's best used is shredded newspaper. It has to be moistened, but not too wet. If you leave it dry, the dryness can actually harm the worms. You place this moistened newspaper in the bin until it's about 3/4 full, or if it's small, or to about half full if it's large. You add the worms to the container, gently, I might add, and a handful of fruits and vegetables, which should be cut up into small pieces for the worms. As the worms eat the food, and you need to look in the bin periodically to see if they're eating the food. You add more food, but do not overfeed these worms. The bin can go anaerobic and will smell if you do. You need about 1 pound of worms to a half a pound of daily garbage. And there's approximately 1,500 worms in 1 pound of worms. The best worms are referred to as brown-nosed red wigglers. They're sometimes referred to as red worms or trout worms. You can buy these worms commercially. There are places that sell them, some bait shops, but when you go to a bait shop, if you buy it there, you make sure that they know that you're buying these worms for composting and not for bait. Otherwise, you may end up with a bait worm, which will not accomplish what you're trying to do. Worms multiply very fast. That 1,500 worms in a pound can double in a very short period of time. Worms are hermaphroditic, which means they are both male and female. So pretty much all of them are laying eggs. One egg from a worm will hatch 3 to 5 baby worms. The worms, as I said previously, like moist conditions. They are very sensitive to temperatures. The temperatures they like are between 55 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. If you go outside those extremes, the worms will likely die. I have a friend who has the equivalent of a large duffel bag that she uses for vermicomposting. In other words, for getting compost from worms. It hangs in her garage, and her garage is now vented to her household. So it heats in the winter and cools in the summer, and that way she can engage in vermicomposting year round. I won't go to that expense, and probably most of you shouldn't, but I will point out that if these worms get outside this temperature range, they will die. What the worms do is they produce castings called vermicompost. Again, as in the case of the compost bins under the cool or hot methods that I discussed previously, this is nothing more than worm poop. But it happens to be the richest type of compost available. 2 ways you can harvest this. One, you can put a tarp or newspaper on like a table or on the ground. You dump the contents of the bin onto the tarp or paper, and you wait for the worms to move to the bottom. Worms hate light. So when you have a light shine on the surface, as I've noted in the description, the worms will move to the bottom, and then you can just harvest the castings off the top. And then put the worms back in the bin. Another method is to place food on one side of the bin. You wait a few days for the worms to move to the food, and then you harvest the side that the worms were not on, or that the food was not on, rather. And these castings can be used in potted plants. They can be used as compost outside. And once they're harvested, you start a new bin. Whether you have to get new worms or not depends upon really the way that you harvest these things and whether or not you have adequate number of worms remaining to continue composting. Another method is referred to as bokashi. This is a fermentation method which is anaerobic, meaning there's no oxygen used. In order to use this method, you have to have a microbial inoculant, which means there has to be something to start the process going. It has very, very low pH, 3 to 4, and this will kill most of the pathogens. The method will handle most food waste. It will not handle liquids, fats, black moldy food, or large bones. It also will not handle leaves, grass, paper, or cardboard waste like you would use in an outside bin. This is a 2-step method. The first 4 to 6 weeks are in the bucket like you see right there. You can keep this bucket in your kitchen if you want. You can keep it outside your garage door. It will not smell, and it has, although it's not shown in this picture, it has a lid that goes on top, and it should be made available. The second portion of this 2-step method is it will spend 2 to 3 weeks in the ground. And the best way to handle this is the trench method, which I'll show you here. In your garden, you begin the step by making a trench and putting the bokashi material into the trench. You then cover it with soil And the end product after numerous weeks, depending on the conditions, of course, is what you see there in the picture. It's a very easy method to utilize. Hugelkultur, German word that means hill or hill mound. This is a pretty easy method for outdoor use. I've used this in my front yard when I built berms. And for those of you who may not know, a berm is nothing more than a mound or a hill in the yard. So this can be used in gardens, vegetable gardens. It can be used in a berm. It can be used in many places. But as you'll see in a minute, there are some limitations. What you do is you dig a trench, and in that trench, you mound logs, branches, leaves, grass clippings, straw, cardboard, newspaper, which is, as I mentioned earlier, is petroleum free, manure, compost, whatever. And this biomass that you create here on top of the soil should then be covered, and it will you plant your vegetables in this. The gradual decay of the wood is a constant source of long-term nutrients for the plants. The wood branches get stacked about 1 foot high, and the reason they're above ground level is because the mound is ultimately going to sink to ground level once it decomposes. The logs and branches, they act like a sponge. When the rainwater is stored, when rainwater occurs, it goes down into the wood soaks it up, or the materials soak it up. And since it's covered, it's not going to evaporate as fast as it would on the surface. As a result, this sponge-like reaction is available for plants to use later. This is a no-till type situation. As I said, the branches are covered with manure or straw to about 4 to 6 inches, and then sod is packed randomly in holes. It looks like a mess right now, but here's the difference between traditional garden bed, vegetable garden, I'll add, hugelkultur bed. The growth you see is cucumbers. And the traditional bed, while it's growing okay and has mulch on top of it, you can see it's not quite as abundant as the hugelkultur bed. This is a hugelkultur bed, which is obviously very tall. Most of you would probably not use this method. This is so tall that in order to keep the outside edges from pushing outside the limit of the bed, they put pallets around to help stabilize the mound. Here you see a garden, vegetable garden using hugelkultur. And again, you can see the growth is pretty abundant. Another method of composting is trench composting. It's very simple. You dig a trench about 12 inches deep. And the reason I have a question mark there is because I live in Dallas. We have clay soil. I don't think I'm capable of digging a 12-inch deep trench. It's very difficult to dig a trench in Dallas. But if you can do it, more power to you. To this trench, you add 4 to 6 inches of compostable materials. As this is the same stuff that you would put into a compost bin. It's mostly vegetative matter. It can be grass. It can be pretty much anything. Kitchen scraps are mostly what you see there. You bury it with the soil, and you bury the materials in the soil where you dug out the trench, and then you go back and fill it. This provides plants with nutrition where it's needed at the root zone. It's invisible and will not produce odors, and it provides a method of composting where either traditional methods you not want to use them, or they're prohibited at that location. Trench composting can be used in rotation also. If you divide the garden into 3 zones, a trench composting zone, a pathway zone or walking zone, and a growing zone, you can use this rotation over a 3-year period and get really healthy plantings and healthy soil. What you do is each year you move the trench compost to a different part of the garden and shift the paths and the growing areas as needed. So as you see in year 1, you have compost in a trench, you have a walking area, and then you have an area C, where plants have been planted. In year 2, you move the plants to space A. You move the compost in the trench to the walking space from the prior year, and you move the walking space to the area C. In the 3rd year, the walking space is moved to area A. The plants are moved to area B, which is where the compost is. And in the new compost material is added to trench C. And as you can see, once you get to the 2nd year, you're planting plants over composted material. So those plants should do very well. At the end of 3 years, there's compost under every part of the garden, and then you start your rotation over again. Sheet composting is also pretty easy. It's ideal in the fall because it makes abundant use of dead leaves, dropped leaves. Spent plants, pretty much anything as you see there can be added to the sheet composting. And you can add a bit of fertilizer to this as well to supply some nitrogen. Sheet composting has advantages because it's very easy. It's very uncomplicated. You can put down sheets of newspaper or cardboard if you want, a little at a time or as much as you want, and you can be used on a small or large scale. It serves to improve the soil and add to existing beds or borders. It's a very easy way to expand a garden with a minimal amount of equipment and material. And as you see the gentleman doing there, by placing that on the ground and putting the compost materials over it, not only will the materials compost, but it will also kill off the weeds under the newspaper. So that completes my discussion. If anyone has any questions, I'm open to take them at this time.
Alrighty, I'm going to go ahead and start with the questions we already have in the chat. This is from Grace. If we keep weeds in a plastic bag for 2 or 3 months, will the seeds die off and allow the dead weeds to be added to the compost?
You're talking about weeds, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the answer is that if you can be sure that most of the seeds are gone, which is not an easy thing to do because some of those weed seeds are very small, and sure, you could do that. Personally, I wouldn't do it. I have enough problem with weeds without trying to run the risk of composting their seeds.
All right, so next question is from Lynn. How much dried molasses do you add to get rid of ants?
The instructions are on the bag, and it depends on what you're buying. I usually add a half a cup as you're turning it to get rid of the ants. And so far, I've been fairly successful. When I did it the first time, I just took some dried molasses and sprinkled it around the top of the compost bin and the top layer. And the next time I came and watered down the compost bin, it was the ants were still there. So turning the bin has a lot to do with it because you displace the ants from their home, their colony, and you also mix up any foodstuffs that they were dining on. And that
All right.
answer, I guess.
Okay,
About,
the next
about a half a
question.
cup.
All right. The next question is from Savannah. How finely should we be shredding the cardboard, and would using Amazon boxes be okay?
Okay, when you use shredded cardboard, I'm talking about the brown corrugated cardboard like you would see in a box maybe that was shipped to you from Amazon or that you see in grocery stores when they receive materials. Do not use cardboard that is white. Do not use cardboard that has any type of foil finish to it. Do not use cardboard that has any painted or printed materials on it. A little bit of printed material that, says this end up or something like that, that's fine. But you don't want to put those kind of materials in your compost bin because they could taint it. You don't know where the ink came from. And as far as the shredding the material, I would get it as fine as you can. I was working at a community garden once that was operated by some people that would rent various spaces, and there was a compost bin there. And one day I went out and, I had instructed them the things they could put in there. And one day I came out and I found an entire box stuffed down into the compost bin. The box had been disassembled, but it was still one giant piece of cardboard. So you want to get that as small as you can. I don't know if running over I don't use cardboard in my bin because it takes it a long time to decompose. I don't know if you could run over it with a lawnmower or sit there and cut it up with a pair of scissors, but I would recommend cutting it as fine as your patience allows. There's no
And
particular
then,
comes into play.
all right, and we have a follow-up question. Can you use
I would say,
paper?
I would say maybe on the cardboard, I would say cut it up no bigger than a dime.
All
And
right, and then the
next
follow-up
question,
question is, can you use paper/mail shreds?
would you repeat that?
Paper or mail shreds?
Again, it becomes a question of what's on the paper. If there's toner on the paper, from a computer printer, I would not use that. If the paper has any printing on it, I would not use that. The same applies to envelopes and anything that you get in the mail that has printing on it. Do not use that material. If you get something in a plain brown envelope, you can use the plain brown envelope, but I would tear off the mailing label, or if it's printed directly on the envelope, I would tear off the printed portion. Does that answer it? Hopefully. Any other questions?
Looks like that's it for now.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
Well, let me just say, have fun composting. And if you have any questions, you can contact us at Dallas County Master Gardeners at that email address. I'm sorry, at that website address. You can also contact the help desk, which we operate at that telephone number. It operates Monday at that time, those time frames. And I want to thank you for having me as a speaker. And I want to thank the audience for being attentive and asking questions. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the week.
all righty. Thank you, Barry, for presenting today. Have a great day, everybody. We'll send out the recording later once it's ready, as well as the presentation.